They threw him out of the building before he could even say his name. Security hauled him through the lobby like he was trouble, like he was nobody. But when his sleeve pulled back and that tattoo surfaced, the woman running one of the most powerful maritime companies in the country went completely still. Because she'd seen that mark before, in her father's handwriting, in a file she was never supposed to find. The man they'd just humiliated in front of everyone, he hadn't come to take something from Hart Maritime. He'd already given them everything, and they'd made sure he got nothing back. If you're new here, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The tie was wrong, and Silas Cole knew it before he even got off the bus. He'd borrowed it from his neighbor, Frank, a retired school custodian who'd kept the thing in a Ziploc bag in his closet since 2009. It was navy with thin gold stripes. Not offensive, not embarrassing, just clearly a tie that had belonged to a different era and a different kind of man. Silas had knotted it in the mirror above the bathroom sink in his studio apartment, the kind with water stains around the edges and a crack running through the lower left corner, and he'd thought, it'll be fine. Then he'd thought, who am I kidding? He tucked it inside his jacket anyway. The bus ride from the Deckland Flats neighborhood to the financial district took 42 minutes, which was enough time for the morning rush to press him up against a woman holding a paper coffee cup with the lid half off, and a teenager whose earbuds were leaking noise loud enough to follow you into your dreams. Silas stood with one hand on the overhead rail, staring out the window at the city going gray in the early light, and told himself to breathe. He was 44 years old. He'd worked maritime rescue ops for 11 years, first as a deckhand on a coast patrol vessel, then as a team lead, then as an operations coordinator, managing 3 vessel response units in open water. He knew how to read weather systems, how to pull a man off a capsized hull in 8-foot swells, how to keep a team functioning when everything around them was falling apart. He'd done it. He had the scars to prove it, including the one on his left forearm that nobody needed to see today. What he did not have, a college degree, the right kind of last name, or anyone willing to return a voicemail in under 2 weeks. The call from Hart Maritime had come 11 days ago. His phone had buzzed while he was cleaning tables at the Port District Diner, his 3rd job in 18 months, following a short stretch loading cargo manifests for a shipping brokerage that folded, and before that, a season of contract maintenance work on tugboats down at the South Docks. The voicemail was professional, brief, corporate. A woman named Sandra Price from HR asking him to come in for an interview regarding an open coordinator position in maritime operations. He'd listened to it twice standing outside the walk-in cooler with a wet rag in his hand. He hadn't told anyone he was going. Not Frank, not his sister in Beaumont who called on Sundays, not the guys at the diner. He didn't want to explain it to anyone until there was something to explain. Hart Maritime Tower was the kind of building that had been designed to make you feel small before you even walked in. 42 stories of glass and structural steel rising off the harbor waterfront, the company's name in brushed chrome letters above the main entrance, each letter roughly the size of a grown man's torso. The lobby was visible from the street, marble floors, a reception desk that looked like it had been imported from somewhere, a security station manned by 2 uniformed guards. There were potted trees inside the building, actual trees. Silas stood on the sidewalk for a moment, adjusted his jacket, and went in. The security desk was the first checkpoint. A guard, mid-30s, thick through the shoulders, name tag that said Bryce, looked up from his station as Silas approached. "I have an interview," Silas said. "Silas Cole, 10 a.m. with HR. Sandra Price." Bryce typed something, looked at the screen, typed something else. He had the practiced expression of someone who dealt with the public all day and had decided somewhere along the way to make it nobody's problem but theirs. "I'm not showing anything for that name," Bryce said. "It was scheduled 11 days ago. I have the voicemail, if that helps." "I'd need to see your name in the system." Bryce didn't look up from the screen. "You're not in the system." "Can you call up to HR? Sandra Price." Bryce looked at him then, just briefly, just enough to take in the borrowed tie, The jacket that fit a little loose through the shoulders, the work-roughened hands resting on the desk. Something shifted in his expression. Not hostility exactly, more like a decision that had already been made. "Sir, if you're not in the system, I can't send you up." "I understand that. I'm asking if you can make a phone call to confirm I should be." "I can't tie up the security line for—" "I'm not asking you to tie up anything. One call, 2 minutes." There was a moment. Then Bryce looked past Silas's shoulder and gave a small nod, and Silas heard the second guard moving before he had time to turn around. A hand closed on his upper arm, not violent but definitive, the kind of grip that communicated direction rather than asked for it. "We're going to need you to step outside," the second guard said. His name tag said Dolan. He was younger than Bryce, trying harder to seem like he wasn't. Silas went still. It was a thing he'd learned early in his career. When someone grabs your arm and starts moving you, the worst thing you can do is resist in the wrong way at the wrong moment. You pick your moment. You stay calm until you can afford not to be. "I have an interview," he said, to the lobby in general, to no one in particular. "Sir, I have a 10 o'clock appointment. I drove here." He hadn't driven, but it didn't matter. "I was contacted by your HR department and asked to come in." Dolan kept moving him toward the door. People in the lobby were watching now. A woman in a camel coat near the elevator banks. A young guy in a suit with a lanyard and a coffee cup paused mid-stride. The marble floor threw sound around like a bowl. "You need to take this outside," Dolan said. Quieter now, which somehow made it worse. "I'm not—" Silas pulled his arm back. Not hard, just enough to stop the forward motion. "I'm not going anywhere until someone makes a phone call." That was when it went sideways. Dolan moved to regain the hold, and Silas shifted his weight the way he always did without thinking. The maritime reflex, the thing you did on a rocking deck when you needed your balance back fast. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even close to a threat. But from the outside, from the lobby, from the woman in the camel coat, it probably looked like something else. Bryce was up from the desk. Dolan had both arms now. They walked him to the front doors with the kind of efficiency that said they'd done this before. Not often, but enough. And the doors opened, and then Silas was on the sidewalk in the gray morning air, the building's polished exterior behind him. People on the street already not looking at him, because looking at a man who just got walked out of a building requires something most people have decided they don't have. He straightened his jacket. His left sleeve had gotten pushed up in the whole thing, shoved toward his elbow, the inside of his forearm exposed. He didn't pull it down immediately. He was too busy trying to remember how to stand like a person who hadn't just been handled like an unwanted package in front of a glass lobby. On the 14th floor of Hart Maritime Tower, Vivian Hart was 15 minutes into a meeting she'd been trying to get out of for 3 weeks. The conference room was all windows on one side, the harbor gray-green below, container ships moving slow and distant across the frame. Around the table, Marcus Elroy, the company's chief operating officer, Dennis Webb, VP of Maritime Logistics, a woman named Patricia Sowers from Legal, and 2 junior analysts who'd been brought in to make the slide deck look like it had more support than it did. The topic, nominally, was Q3 Regional Ops Restructuring. What it actually was, as it had been for the last 4 of these meetings, was Marcus Elroy making a case for contracting out the Coastal Coordination Division to Oren Maritime Group, a firm that Marcus had done business with before he came to Hart, and with which he had, in Vivian's private assessment, a relationship that probably shouldn't survive scrutiny. "If we go with Oren," Marcus was saying, clicking to the next slide, "we're looking at a 12% cost reduction in the first fiscal year, conservative estimate." "What do the safety metrics look like for their coordination units?" Vivian said. "They're competitive." "That's not what I asked." Patricia Sowers made a small noise that wasn't quite a cough. Dennis Webb found something on his notepad that needed immediate attention. Marcus smiled in the way he always smiled when he felt cornered. Not warm, just deployed. "I can get you the full breakdown before next Thursday. Get it to me by end of day today." Vivian closed the folder in front of her. "We're not making a decision on Oren until I've seen their last 5 years of incident reports, not their pitch materials." Before Marcus could answer, her assistant Cleo appeared in the conference room doorway with the expression that meant something was happening and Vivian was going to want to know about it. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Cleo said. "There's a situation downstairs." The situation, as Cleo explained in the elevator, was that a man had come in claiming he had an interview that didn't appear to exist in the system. Security had removed him, and the man was currently standing on the sidewalk in front of the building, which wouldn't have required Vivian's attention, except that one of the lobby employees had called up to Cleo because, and this was the part that Cleo delivered with a kind of careful neutrality, the man was causing a disruption in the lobby experience, which meant someone had made a complaint, someone higher up than Bryce, and now Cleo was trying to figure out how much of this was actually Vivian's problem versus how much was people passing the blame upward until it landed somewhere with authority. Vivian came out through the main lobby doors onto the sidewalk. Silas Cole was standing about 10 feet from the entrance. He was a tall man, lean in the way that suggested the weight had come off at some point and hadn't fully come back, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that needed another pass with the razor. He had one hand in his jacket pocket, and he was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who was very consciously not letting their face show what they were actually thinking. His left sleeve was still pushed up from whatever had happened with the guards. Vivian saw the tattoo. It wasn't large, maybe 4 inches, high on the inside of the forearm. A trident, the tines sharp and symmetrical, with a rope wrapped once around the shaft. She knew that tattoo. She'd seen it in photographs, 3 photographs specifically, in a waterproof envelope she'd found at the bottom of the second drawer of her father's old mahogany desk, the one she hadn't touched for 2 years after he died, and then couldn't stop opening. The photographs were from what her father had called, in the one page of handwritten notes tucked with them, the Kelleran incident, a rescue, a bad one. Off the coast years back during a contracted operations response that had gone sideways in ways that cost people their livelihoods and at least one man his entire career. The trident tattoo was the mark of the Kelleran rescue team, the unit that had gone in when the situation was already past critical. Vivian walked the 10 feet. "I'm Vivian Hart," she said. "I run this company. Can you tell me your name?" He looked at her. He had the eyes of someone who'd learned to read people fast. Not suspicious exactly, but careful, assessing, deciding how much the next 30 seconds was going to cost him. "Silas Cole," he said. "I had an interview this morning, 10 a.m., with HR. Can I ask who contacted you?" "A woman named Sandra Price. I have the voicemail." Vivian looked at his forearm. She couldn't help it. The tattoo was just there, right there, and she was trying to do the math in her head, the years, the age, the timing. And she needed another 3 seconds, and she didn't want to ask him about it on a public sidewalk, which meant she needed to make a decision. "Mr. Cole," she said, "would you come back inside?" He looked at the building, then at her, then at the building again. "I was just walked out," he said, "by 2 guys who didn't want to hear it. I know. I saw that on the lobby feed before I came down." She said it without softening it, because she thought he'd probably respect the honesty more than a polished apology. "I'm asking you to come back in anyway. I want to understand what happened with your interview, and I'd rather do that inside." A beat. On the street behind them, a delivery truck rumbled past. The harbor wind came in off the water and moved the flag on the building next door. "All right," Silas said. He pulled his sleeve down as he walked back toward the entrance, but not before Vivian had gotten a good look. The trident, the rope, the faded edges of old ink on weathered skin, the mark of men who'd gone out in conditions where the smart money said to stay put. Bryce at the security desk looked up when they came back through the doors and had about half a second to figure out from Vivian's expression that he should not say anything, which he managed. Vivian led Silas across the marble lobby, the same marble he'd just been walked out of, the same potted trees, the same ring of eyes from employees who'd watched the earlier scene and were now doing a second read on the situation. She could feel the recalibration happening in the room. She didn't particularly care. She hit the elevator call button and the doors opened immediately. They rode up to the 14th floor without talking. Silas stood with his back straight and his hands clasped in front of him, looking at the elevator doors. Vivian looked at the floor counter and thought about a handwritten note she'd read so many times she could recall the exact shape of her father's lowercase r. The young man who led the water approach, her father had written, did not have to go in. He went in anyway. "I do not think I will ever fully know how to account for that." The elevator opened. "This way." Vivian said. She took him to the small conference room at the end of the hall, not the big one where Marcus Elroy's presentation was still technically in progress. She closed the door. Through the window, the harbor sat wide and cold and gray under the morning overcast, the water moving in that slow, heavy way it moved when the weather was thinking about changing. Silas sat down across from her. He was still watching her the way he'd watched her on the sidewalk, careful, measuring, not unfriendly, but not willing to assume anything either. "Mr. Cole," Vivian said, "how long ago did you work maritime rescue ops?" Something shifted in his face. Not a lot, just a small movement around the eyes, the kind that happened when someone said something they weren't expecting. 11 years, he said. Gave it up about 6 years back. Why'd you leave? He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice was level, the kind of level that takes work to maintain. It left me, he said. There's a difference. Vivian put her hands flat on the table. The harbor was behind her, gray and patient, going all the way to the edge of where the sky came down. I need to ask you something, she said. And I need you to understand I'm not asking to be intrusive. I'm asking because I think the answer matters more than either of us know right now. Silas waited. Were you part of a rescue unit, she said, roughly 15 years ago? A unit operating under a contract response designation, in an incident that took place approximately 40 nautical miles off the coast near the Kelleran Shelf? The silence in the room lasted long enough that Vivian could hear the ventilation system and, faintly, Marcus Elroy's voice still going down the hall. Silas Cole looked at her across the conference table with something in his face she couldn't entirely read. Recognition, maybe, or the thing that lives next to recognition. The thing that comes when someone finally says out loud the name of an event you've been carrying alone for so long that you'd stopped believing anyone else knew it existed. Yeah, he said. His voice was quieter now. I was there. Vivian nodded slowly. She thought about what her father had written. She thought about the photographs, 3 of them, in a waterproof envelope. She thought about the name that appeared in those pages. A name she'd gone looking for, twice, through maritime licensing boards and public records, and had come up empty both times. She thought about the fact that this man had walked into her building this morning looking for work, with a borrowed tie and an appointment that no longer existed in her company's system, and had been walked back out by security before anyone had asked him a single question. Mr. Cole, she said, I think we have a great deal to talk about. The small conference room had a coffee machine on the credenza against the wall, one of those single-cup pod machines that corporations bought because they looked like hospitality without requiring anyone to actually care. Vivian got up and made 2 cups without asking, because Silas Cole looked like a man who hadn't eaten much that morning, and because she needed something to do with her hands while she figured out where to start. She set 1 cup in front of him and sat back down. The interview, she said. Let me deal with that first, because I want you to understand I didn't know it was gone before today. Silas wrapped both hands around the cup. He didn't drink from it immediately, just held it, which told her something about what the morning had already cost him. Someone pulled it from the system? That's what I'm going to find out. She picked up her phone and sent Cleo a message. Pull the HR intake log for the past 2 weeks. All coordinator applications. Flag anything modified after initial entry. She set the phone face down on the table. Sandra Price. She's one of our HR coordinators. Did she give you any specifics about the role when she called? She said it was a maritime operations coordinator position. Mid-level. She said my application had been flagged for its field experience and they wanted to meet in person. Where did you apply? Through the company's jobs portal, about 3 weeks ago. He paused. I didn't expect a call, honestly. I've applied to 14 positions in the last year. Most of them don't call back at all. Vivian looked at him. There was a flatness to the way he said it. Not self-pity, just the exhaustion of someone who'd been grinding against something unyielding for long enough that they'd stopped expecting it to give. She'd seen that look in people before. She hadn't always known what it meant. What have you been doing? She said. Since maritime ops. Whatever I could find. He said it without decoration. Cargo manifest work, dock maintenance, some contract tugboat work last season. I'm at a diner in Deckland right now, cleaning tables mostly, some short order when they're short-handed. The harbor was still there through the window behind her. She didn't look at it. She kept her eyes on him and thought about what her father's notes had said, the young man who led the water approach, and tried to map that onto the man across from her, the one who was gripping a paper coffee cup like it was the most solid thing in his morning. "Mr. Cole," she said, "can I ask you about the Kelleran incident directly?" He looked at the cup. A moment passed. "You can ask," he said. "I don't know what you already know, so I'm not sure where to start." "Start wherever it makes sense to you." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he set the cup down, sat back, and looked at the window the way people look at things when they're not actually seeing them, when they're looking at something that happened a long time ago that left a mark and never fully closed. "There was a vessel," he said. "Research vessel, privately contracted, operating under a Hart Maritime Support Agreement. It got into trouble on the Kelleran Shelf in bad weather. Structural failure below the waterline, taking water faster than the crew could manage. Standard distress protocol. Our unit got the call." "You were the team lead?" "Operations lead for the water approach." "Yeah. We had 2 boats and a 6-person team. The conditions were bad. 8 to 10-foot swells, visibility down, wind pushing the current sideways. It wasn't a situation where you went in the water voluntarily." He stopped. "But someone had to go in the water, and you did." "Me and one other guy, Decker. He's not in maritime anymore either." Something crossed his face. "We got 3 people off the vessel before it went under. One of them was—" He paused again, differently this time. "One of them was a man named Hart." The room was very quiet. "My father," Vivian said. Silas looked at her. He hadn't known, she realized, hadn't made the connection until this moment. Or maybe he had suspected and hadn't been sure how to navigate it. "I didn't know that until right now," he said carefully. "I knew his name. I didn't know—" He stopped. "I'm sorry about your father. He died 2 years ago. It wasn't the incident. He had a good 14 years after." She said it steadily. "But he wrote about it. That's how I know your name, Mr. Cole. He kept notes about the rescue. He kept photographs. He kept a page of handwriting that I've read so many times I could tell you every word of it from memory." Silas said nothing. His expression had gone somewhere she couldn't fully read. "He wrote that you didn't have to go in," Vivian said. "That the conditions were beyond what protocol required, and that you went in anyway." "Protocol is a floor, not a ceiling," Silas said. "You go to the floor when that's all you've got. That day we had more. What happened after the rescue?" And there it was. The thing she'd been building toward, the thing she needed him to say out loud before she went back through her father's files and through whatever HR's intake logs were going to show her. She needed to hear his version, not because she didn't believe her father's notes, but because she needed to know how much of it Silas himself understood about what had been done to him. He picked up the coffee cup. Drank from it this time. "What happened after," he said, "is that the contracting firm that held our unit's operational agreement, company called Drexler Maritime Solutions, decided that the Kelleran response had been handled improperly. That we'd exceeded our operational mandate by conducting a water approach in those conditions without secondary authorization. Had you?" "No. I had verbal clearance from the unit supervisor on site, which is standard protocol in field conditions when you can't wait for a written order." His jaw tightened slightly. "But the unit supervisor was a Drexler employee. And Drexler had a liability problem because the vessel that went under was operating under a maintenance contract with them, and the structural failure that caused the distress was in a section they'd certified 2 months prior." Vivian put it together. "So they needed someone else to be responsible. They needed someone who'd made an unauthorized call under pressure, someone who could absorb the liability finding, someone who wasn't on their permanent payroll." He said it without anger, which was somehow worse than anger because it meant the anger had burned through a long time ago and left something quieter and harder in its place. "My operational license got suspended pending review. The review took 16 months. By the time it came back cleared, partial clearance, conditions attached, my career was done." No one hires a coordinator who's been through a 16-month regulatory review, regardless of the outcome. The paperwork follows you. And Drexler? Settled the vessel maintenance liability privately. Their supervisor, who gave me verbal clearance, signed a statement saying he hadn't. He got a promotion 8 months later. Silas looked at the window. I know that because Decker looked it up. Decker had more energy for being angry than I did by that point. Vivian's phone buzzed on the table. She flipped it over. Cleo. Log shows the Cole application was modified 9 days ago. Original interview slot deleted and replaced with a no-show notation. The modification was made from Dennis Webb's system credentials. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down and looked at Silas Cole across the table and thought, of course it was Dennis Webb. Webb who'd been in the lobby this morning when she'd come down. Webb who'd gone still and then immediately started looking at his phone when he saw her walking Silas back inside. Mr. Cole, she said, I'm going to need about an hour. I'm going to ask you to wait, and I understand if that feels like more of the same. Being told to hold on, being managed, but I'm asking anyway. He looked at her steadily. What are you going to do in an hour? I'm going to pull my father's files, and I'm going to have a conversation with someone in this building that is going to be uncomfortable for everyone involved, including me. She paused. And after that, I'm going to need you to still be here. He considered that. I'll be here, he said. Her father's office was on the 38th floor and had been locked since the week after the funeral. Not officially, not permanently, just locked in the way that things get locked when nobody wants to be the person who decides what happens to them next. Vivian had a key. She'd had one for 2 years and used it maybe 5 times, each time feeling like she was walking into somewhere she hadn't been invited, even though it was, technically, her building. The office smelled like paper and something faintly chemical from the leather conditioner her father had used on the chair. His desk was mahogany, wide and scratched in the lower right corner from a chair leg that had gotten away from him once during a bad call, and that he'd never had fixed because, he'd told her this, he wanted to remember that some things just hit and leave a mark, and you live with it. The second drawer on the left side. Vivian sat down behind the desk and opened it. The waterproof envelope was still there, under a folder of harbor use agreements from the early years of the company. She'd known it would be. She hadn't moved it. She took it out and put it on the desk in front of her. 3 photographs. 1 page of notes in her father's handwriting. The R's shaped like small doorways. The pressure of the pen heavy in the way it always was when he was writing something he meant. She read the notes again, though she didn't need to. She looked at the photographs. Blurry, taken in bad light, one of them showing the side of a rescue vessel and 2 figures in the water and a 3rd figure being pulled over the rail. She looked at that 3rd figure for a long time, the one being pulled over the rail, and thought about how her father had never talked about the Kelleran incident publicly. Not once. She'd asked him once, in the last year of his life, why he'd kept it so quiet, and he'd said, because the people who saved me paid for it later, and talking about it wouldn't have given them anything back. She'd thought, at the time, that he was being modest. She understood now that he'd known something she hadn't, that the rescue had been used against the men who performed it, and that going public with his account would have meant nothing unless he was willing to go further than a statement, further than a press mention, further than the kind of narrative that gets absorbed and moved past. She'd found the envelope by accident, 2 months after he died. By that point, the people responsible had had 15 years to bury the trail. She put the envelope in her bag and went back to the elevator. Dennis Webb's office was on the 12th floor, which was the floor where the VP-level people sat in offices with glass walls and views of the office park side of the building rather than the harbor, which was not an accident. Her father had arranged it that way and never explained why, but Vivian had always thought it was a quiet piece of institutional honesty about where the real authority lived. She knocked on the frame of Webb's open door and went in without waiting. Webb was at his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled. He was 51 years old, the kind of man who'd spent his career being good enough at things that nobody looked closely at the other stuff, the part underneath the competence. He looked up when she came in and did a reasonable job of looking neutral. Vivian, I was going to come find you about the Oren restructuring numbers. Sit down, Dennis. He'd been half standing. He sat back down. She put her phone on his desk, screen up, showing Cleo's message. He looked at it. His face didn't change much, but the stillness of it changed, the quality of the stillness, the effort it was taking. The Cole application, she said. The interview you deleted. I flagged it as a duplicate entry. There was a system issue last week that created... Dennis. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I'm not asking you to explain it yet. I'm telling you what I know so you understand where we are. I have the system log. I have your credentials on the modification, and I have the man you are trying to send home sitting on the 14th floor drinking bad coffee. She let that sit for a second. What I want to know right now, before I decide what this means for your position here, is how you knew who he was. Webb was quiet. His hands were flat on the desk. He had good hands for a desk man, big and blunt-fingered, the kind that looked more useful than they were. I recognize the name, he said finally. From the Kelleran file. What Kelleran file? The internal one. Drexler's incident report. We have a copy in legal archives, or we did. Your father kept documentation on the response because Hart Maritime was the client on the vessel. He paused. Silas Cole's name is in that report, as the operative whose license suspension triggered the liability review. Which means you knew exactly who he was when his application came in. I knew he'd been involved in a regulatory action. You knew he'd been scapegoated for a Drexler liability problem, Vivian said. There's a difference, and I think you know that too. She looked at him. Did Marcus ask you to pull the interview? Something moved across Webb's face, fast, controlled, but there. She'd landed on the right thing. This was your call? She said. Not Marcus? I made a judgment, Webb said, that bringing someone with that kind of regulatory history into an operations role, he was cleared. 16 months later, the review came back clean. With conditions attached. The conditions were boilerplate. 2 years of supervised operation, which he fulfilled before the industry locked him out anyway. She picked up her phone. You made a judgment that a man with a complicated history on his paperwork shouldn't be given the opportunity to explain himself in person, and you made that judgment and then deleted the record of it so that no one would know it had been made. Webb didn't say anything. Pull up the Kelleran archive file, she said. Legal archives, you said. Vivian, right now, Dennis, I want to see what we have. The legal archives on the 3rd floor were managed by a woman named Harriet, who'd been with the company since before Vivian was born, and who treated the archive room with the kind of quiet authority that came from being the only person who reliably knew where anything was. Vivian went down with Webb, who had stopped trying to manage the situation and was now simply complying in the way that men comply when they've decided the math has turned against them. Harriet found the Kelleran file in 11 minutes. It was a physical file, not digital. Her father's era, transferred to the archive when the company migrated its records system in 2017. Vivian took it to the small table in the archive room and opened it. It was thicker than she expected. Drexler's incident report was there, 40 pages, dense with operational language and liability framing, the kind of document that was designed to look thorough while ensuring that the conclusions were baked into the structure from the first paragraph. Silas Cole's name appeared 14 times. His verbal clearance from the supervising officer appeared exactly once, in a subordinate clause buried in a footnote on page 31, and was characterized as alleged authorization that could not be independently verified. Attached behind the Drexler report was a separate document, thinner, 6 pages, handwritten in some parts and typed in others. Hart Maritime's own internal account of the incident, compiled by her father. Vivian had not known this document existed. It was not in the envelope upstairs. This was something her father had written and filed here, and apparently never mentioned to anyone. She read it. It took her 12 minutes. She read slowly, because her father's handwriting was dense, and because some of what he'd written required her to stop and breathe for a moment before she could continue. Her father's account named the supervisor who had given Silas verbal clearance. It named him clearly, with a full name, and characterized his statement to Drexler's review board as contradicting what he had told the rescue team on site. Her father had spoken with a member of the rescue team, not Silas, someone else, one of the other three from the water approach, within a week of the incident, before the review process had concluded, and that person had provided details that matched Silas's account in every verifiable particular. Her father had written, near the end, "I have debated whether to submit this account to the review board directly. I have decided not to because I am not confident it would reach the outcome I believe it warrants, and a failed intervention may cause more damage to the operative's position than silence. I am filing this here. If the situation changes, or if someone with more standing than I currently have finds reason to revisit the record, this account should be available to them." Vivian sat with that for a moment. Her father had been 58 when the Kelleran incident happened. He'd been running Hart Maritime for 9 years, but the maritime contracting world was Drexler's territory, not his, and he'd known that going up against them directly, a client company challenging a contractor's official incident report, would have resulted in a protracted dispute that his lawyers would have told him to avoid. He'd done the thing that careful, complicated men sometimes do when they know the right thing and also know the cost. He'd preserved the evidence and waited for a moment that didn't come in his lifetime. She closed the file. Dennis Webb was standing against the wall with his hands in his pockets, watching her. "You knew this file was here," she said. "I knew the archive had Kelleran documentation," he said. "I hadn't read your father's addendum." She looked at him for a long moment. She believed the second part. She wasn't sure about the first. "I need you to stay available today," she said. "Don't make any calls, don't message Marcus or anyone else about this conversation, and don't leave the building without telling me first." She picked up the file. "I mean all of that, Dennis. Every word of it." She took the archive file and went back to the elevator, and she thought about Silas Cole sitting on the 14th floor, still waiting, still not knowing that his own vindication had been sitting in a cardboard folder in this building's basement for 15 years, filed by the man he'd pulled out of the water, kept safe by someone who hadn't lived long enough to do anything more useful with it than keep it safe. She thought about what it was going to feel like to tell him. She thought about the harbor, the gray water, the current that ran along the Kelleran shelf, and she thought about what her father had written in the very last line of his account, the line she hadn't let herself read in front of Dennis Webb. Whatever comes of this, the record should show that Silas Cole acted with the kind of integrity that most people spend their careers claiming to have and rarely demonstrate. He went into that water for strangers. Whatever this company can do, when the time comes, it should do. The elevator doors opened on the 14th floor. Vivian walked back to the small conference room. Silas was still there. He'd moved his chair slightly, angling it toward the window, and he was looking out at the harbor. The same gray water, the same container ships moving slow and distant. He turned when she came in. She set her father's file on the table between them. She put her father's envelope on top of it. She didn't soften it. She didn't build up to it with careful language. She just said, "My father wrote down everything. He wrote down what happened, what was done to you afterward, and what he believed about both. He filed it in our legal archive 15 years ago, and it's been sitting there since." Silas looked at the file. He didn't touch it. His face had gone very still, the way faces go still when someone is trying to process something that is almost too large to move through all at once. "He wrote it down," Silas said. "Yes. And nobody pulled it, nobody used it. He filed it, and then he was careful in the way people are careful when they don't want to make things worse, and then he ran out of time." She paused. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't cover it." Silas put his hand flat on the table, not on the file, just next to it. He looked at the harbor. The container ships moved. The light was shifting toward midday. "I looked for him," Silas said. His voice was quieter now, different in texture. "After the review came back, I wasn't looking for anything from him. I just wanted to know he was all right. I found an article about Hart Maritime expanding into Pacific routing, and there was a photograph of him in it. He looked fine. I figured that was enough." He stopped. "I didn't know he remembered." "He remembered," Vivian said. "Everything." The ventilation system ran. Outside, the harbor did what harbors do. It kept moving. indifferent and enormous, the water going where it went regardless of what people were doing with their lives at its edge. Silas picked up the coffee cup. It had gone cold, but he drank from it anyway, the way people do when they need something in their hands to be doing something with. "What happens now?" he said. Vivian looked at her father's file. She thought about Marcus Elroy still running his Orin Maritime pitch somewhere in this building. She thought about Dennis Webb in his glass-walled office with the wrong view. She thought about a lobby with marble floors and 2 guards who'd grabbed a man by the arm because he didn't look like he belonged. "Now," she said, "I make some decisions that I should have been in a position to make a long time ago, and I'm going to need you to be willing to let me do that." Silas set the cup down. He looked at her with those careful eyes, the ones that assessed and measured and had clearly been burned enough times to stay cautious. "I'm listening," he said. What Vivian needed first was 2 hours, and she used them the way she used most things when she was working through something that mattered, methodically, without announcing the plan until the plan was ready to be announced. She started with Cleo. Cleo Marsh had been her assistant for 4 years and had survived 3 rounds of executive turnover, 2 restructuring initiatives, and 1 period during which Vivian had been difficult to work for in ways she'd later acknowledged without quite apologizing for. Cleo was 31, organized in the way that suggested she'd been organizing things since before anyone asked her to, and she had the useful quality of understanding which conversations required discretion without being told. Vivian sat across from Cleo at the small desk outside her office and laid out what she needed. Not everything. Not the full weight of the archive file. Not her father's handwriting. Not the specific shape of what she was going to do. Just the operational pieces. A company-wide gathering in the main lobby, 2 p.m., framed as an all-hands address. Attendance expected from all building staff, including executive floor. She wanted it communicated as coming from her office directly, not through the department heads. "How much notice do people need?" Cleo said. 3 hours. That's what they're getting." Cleo wrote it down. Marcus is going to push back. He's got the Orin follow-up call at 2:30. "Marcus can reschedule the Orin call." Vivian said it without particular emphasis. "Actually, don't tell Marcus. Let the general notice go out and let him find out with everyone else." Cleo looked up. It was a brief look, calibrated. The look of someone who understood that the instruction meant something beyond scheduling logistics. "All right," Cleo said, and wrote that down too. The second thing Vivian did was call Patricia Sowers in legal. Patricia was 55, careful, and had a way of speaking in full sentences even under pressure that Vivian had always found steadying. She'd been the one who'd helped Vivian navigate the estate paperwork after her father died, and she'd done it without adding to the emotional weight of the process, which was its own form of competence. Vivian told her about the archive file. She read her 3 passages from her father's addendum over the phone, the ones that named the supervisor, characterized the statement to the review board, and described the corroborating account from the rescue team member. She told Patricia that she needed a legal read today on what the file meant in terms of the company's liability exposure, not toward Silas Cole, but toward what had been done to him using documentation that Hart Maritime had possessed and never submitted. Patricia was quiet for a moment after Vivian finished. "Your father made a deliberate decision not to submit it to the review board," Patricia said. "Yes. And now you're going to submit it." "I'm going to make it part of the public record," Vivian said. "That's different from submitting it to a board that no longer exists." Another pause. "Give me 90 minutes, Patricia said. "Don't do anything with the file until I've read it myself." "You have until 1:30. She spent the next 40 minutes in the executive conference room on the 14th floor. The big one, the one with Marcus's presentation materials still on the side table, going through the Drexler incident report page by page with a legal pad, marking the places where the language was engineered rather than descriptive. There were more of them than she'd expected. The report had been written by people who were good at what they did, and what they did was construct a narrative that looked thorough while foreclosing the questions that would have opened into something they didn't want opened. It was not a crude document. That was the thing that kept catching her. It was a careful, skilled piece of misdirection, and it had worked for 15 years, and the man it had worked against was currently sitting in a conference room 2 doors down, eating a sandwich that Cleo had quietly arranged without being asked. She went to check on him once, briefly, around noon. He was at the window with the sandwich half-eaten on the table beside him, looking out at the harbor the same way he'd been looking at it earlier. He turned when she came in. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "You don't need to check." "I know." She looked at him. "I wanted to make sure you had food. Your assistant is extremely efficient." "She's the best person in this building. I don't tell her that enough." Vivian glanced at her father's file, still on the table. "There's going to be something happening at 2 o'clock. I'd like you to be part of it." "What kind of something?" "The kind where people find out what they should have known a long time ago." She met his eyes. "I'm not going to put you through anything without your agreement, but I want you to hear it directly from me before it happens." He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her all morning, measuring, careful, not quite trusting, but not dismissing either. It was the look of a man who'd been told things before by people with authority, and had learned that authority and intention were not the same variable. "What exactly are you planning?" he said. So she told him, not in broad strokes. She told him specifically. The lobby gathering, who would be there, what she intended to say, what documents she intended to show. She told him about his own name in her father's addendum and what her father had written about him in the final lines. She watched his face while she told him that part, and she watched it do the thing faces do when something lands that was not expected. Not a dramatic reaction, not breaking down, just a kind of shift in the quality of stillness, like a room when the barometric pressure changes. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. "You don't have to make it a public thing," he said. "You could handle it internally, paperwork, correction of record. I'm not asking for a scene." "I know you're not." She sat down across from him, not behind the table, but in the chair beside it, which was a different thing. "But the scene already happened, Mr. Cole. This morning, in the lobby, with everyone watching. What I'm proposing isn't adding a scene. It's answering the one that already occurred." She paused. "The people who watched you get walked out of here this morning, they formed a conclusion. I want them to have the information they needed to form a different one." He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. They were scarred across the knuckles in the minor way that came from years of rope and metal and cold water, and not from anything dramatic, just from sustained use. "All right," he said. He said it the same way he'd said it on the sidewalk. Not warmly, not with relief, just as a word that committed him to something he'd decided to trust marginally, more than the alternative. Oh, at 1:15, Patricia Sowers came to Vivian's office with a yellow legal pad covered in her own careful handwriting and a look that said she'd used the 90 minutes completely. She sat down. She put the legal pad on Vivian's desk. "The file is solid," she said. "Your father's account is corroborated in the specific claims by the Drexler report itself, not the conclusions of the report, but the factual narrative it contains, which actually supports your father's version more than it supports Drexler's characterization." She tapped the pad. The supervisor, Rowan Cates, gave a statement to the review board that the verbal clearance for water approach was never issued. Your father's account names him saying the opposite, on the evening of the rescue, in front of 2 witnesses. One of those witnesses is identifiable through the rescue team manifest. Is Kate still findable? He retired from maritime operations in 2019. He's not unreachable. Patricia looked at her steadily. "Vivian, I want to be clear about the legal exposure here. Hart Maritime's liability is limited because your father was acting as a private individual when he compiled his account. He filed it in company archives, but it wasn't submitted as a formal company position. What you're doing today in the lobby is going to constitute a company action. We should be precise about what we're claiming and what we're characterizing." "I'm not claiming anything that isn't in those documents," Vivian said. "I know. I'm saying be precise. Let the documents do the talking. Don't overreach in your characterization of what they prove. They prove enough on their own." Patricia sat back. "And you need to be prepared for the possibility that Marcus Elroy is going to know what this means before you finish talking." "I'm counting on it," Vivian said. Patricia looked at her for a moment longer. "Your father would have done this," she said. "He just never figured out how." He figured out how. He ran out of time. Vivian picked up the file. Help me put together what I'm going to show them. By 1:50, the lobby of Hart Maritime Tower was doing the particular kind of filling up that happened when people weren't entirely sure what they'd been called down for. Staff from the upper floors came in clusters, some in jackets, some still with lanyards and coffee cups, some clearly having been pulled from meetings. The lobby's marble floor, which had been mostly empty that morning when 2 security guards walked Silas Cole out through the front doors, was now holding somewhere around 200 people who'd arranged themselves in the loose, uncertain configuration of an audience that hadn't been told what kind of show to expect. Vivian watched from the mezzanine level. She could see Marcus Elroy near the back, by the far pillar. He'd come in 3 minutes ago with Dennis Webb, which told her that Webb had, despite her instruction, found a way to tell Marcus something. Not everything, probably, but enough. Marcus had his arms crossed and was scanning the room with the particular expression of a man who was trying to look unconcerned in a situation that was making him very concerned. Webb was standing slightly behind him, which was itself a kind of information. Bryce and Dolan were at the security desk, which was where they should be. They looked uncomfortable in the specific way of people who'd done their job correctly by the rules they'd been given and were now sensing that the rules themselves were going to be re-examined. Sandra Price from HR was near the reception desk, which Vivian noticed because Sandra was the person who had called Silas Cole 11 days ago and set this whole chain of events in motion by doing something as simple as looking at an application and thinking, this person is worth a conversation. Silas was not in the lobby. He was in the elevator vestibule on the second floor, Vivian's instruction, because she hadn't wanted him standing in the lobby waiting while people filtered in and looked at him with the same eyes they'd used this morning when he was being walked out. He'd be coming down when she called for him, and not before. She looked at the lobby for another 30 seconds. Then she walked to the mezzanine railing and she let the room come to quiet. It took about 20 seconds. People saw her, registered the fact that she was at the railing rather than behind a podium or on a raised platform, and quieted in the way that crowds quiet when something is clearly about to begin and they don't entirely know what. I'm not going to take a lot of your time, Vivian said. Her voice carried well in the marble space. Her father had told her once that he'd chosen the lobby dimensions partly for this, that a company's leadership should be able to speak to its people without a microphone, that a room with a microphone was already admitting that the distance was too great. But I need to talk to you about what happened in this room this morning, and I need to do it in this room specifically, because that's where it happened and because I think it matters where things get corrected. The room was quiet. She could see people looking at each other briefly, just briefly, the quick sidelong check that meant, "Do you know what this is about?" At 10 o'clock this morning, Vivian said, a man came into this lobby for a job interview that this company had invited him to. He was told his name wasn't in the system. He was physically removed from the building by security before anyone asked him a single question beyond his name. She paused. I want to be fair about the security team. They were operating on the information they had, and the information they had was incomplete because it had been made incomplete intentionally. I'll get to that. She looked around the lobby. The man who was removed from this building is someone that most of you walked past this morning without knowing who he was. I didn't know who he was either until I saw something on his forearm that I recognized from my father's files. She looked down at the folder in her hands. My father founded this company. A lot of you know that. What most of you don't know, what I didn't fully know until today, is that there's a chapter of this company's history that was deliberately buried, and that the burying of it destroyed a man's career and left him spending the last 15 years working whatever jobs he could find because the maritime industry had effectively closed its doors to him. She opened the folder. I'm going to tell you what that chapter is, and then I'm going to show you the documentation, and then the man himself is going to walk into this lobby, the same lobby he was walked out of this morning, and I'd like you to understand who you're looking at when he does. She told them about Kelleran. She didn't use operational language or regulatory terminology. She told it the way her father had written it. In plain description, the weather conditions, the vessel going under, the rescue team that had gone in the water when the conditions said they shouldn't have had to. She said Silas Cole's name. She said what he'd done. She said what had been done to him afterward. And she used the word deliberately once and let it sit without elaborating, because the documentation was going to elaborate for her. She held up the pages. She read, verbatim, the critical passage from the Drexler incident report, the footnote on page 31, the alleged authorization language, the way the verbal clearance had been technically acknowledged and then structurally dismissed. Then she read her father's account of the same event, the supervisor's name, the evening of the rescue, the statement made in front of witnesses that contradicted what was later sworn to a review board. The lobby was very quiet. She looked up. The review board that suspended Silas Cole's license took 16 months to return a partial clearance, she said. By the time it did, his career was functionally over. He's been doing contract work and service jobs since then. He applied to this company 3 weeks ago because he has skills that are genuinely valuable to our operations. And because, and I'm speculating here, but I don't think I'm wrong, because this was one of the few maritime companies whose name he associated with something other than the worst period of his professional life. She looked toward the back of the lobby, where Marcus Elroy was no longer maintaining the expression of unconcern. He was watching her with the focused attention of a man calculating something. His interview was scheduled, Vivian said, and then it was deleted. The deletion was made from a VP-level credential on this floor 9 days after the interview was booked. She didn't say Webb's name. She didn't need to. I don't know yet how much was known, and I don't know yet whether more than one person was involved in the decision. What I know is that it was done, and that it was done because someone recognized Silas Cole's name from the Kelleran regulatory file and decided that the regulatory history was sufficient reason to make him disappear from the schedule before he could come in and demonstrate otherwise. She closed the folder. What I'm going to do about that is a separate conversation, she said. But I want everyone in this room to understand something before we have it. The reason that decision was made this morning was the same reason that Drexler made theirs 15 years ago. Someone looked at a complicated piece of paper attached to a man's name and made a conclusion without looking at the man. And the man they didn't look at spent the better part of his adult life trying to recover from the conclusions people made about him before they asked him a single question. She looked at Cleo, who was standing near the elevator vestibule entrance. Cleo moved. The elevator doors opened on the far side of the lobby. Silas Cole walked out. He walked the same way he'd walked back into the building earlier that morning, straight, measured, a little careful in the way of someone who was not fully certain of the ground they were walking on. He was still in the jacket with the borrowed tie. He hadn't changed. He still looked like what he was, a man who'd ridden the bus to a job interview and gotten more than he bargained for before 10 in the morning. He stopped at the edge of the gathered crowd. People turned. 200 people, give or take, looking at one man in a borrowed tie in the same marble lobby where they'd watched him get walked to the door a few hours before. Vivian watched from the mezzanine. She watched the room do the thing rooms did when information arrived that rearranged the landscape. Not a dramatic shift, not applause or murmur, just a subtle collective recalibration. The kind that happened in the face and the posture before it showed up anywhere else. She could see it moving through the lobby the way weather moved across open water. Not fast, but unmistakable. Sandra Price, near the reception desk, had one hand over her mouth. Not crying, just holding something in. Bryce, at the security station, was looking at Silas Cole with an expression that was not easy to read. Not guilt exactly, but the specific discomfort of a person who had done their job correctly by the information they'd been given and was now in the process of understanding that the information had been engineered, which was a different kind of culpability and also a different kind of hurt. Silas looked around the lobby. He didn't look up at Vivian on the mezzanine. He looked at the room, at the marble floor, at the people who were looking at him, and his face was doing the same thing it had done in the conference room when she'd told him about her father's notes. That particular stillness, the pressurized kind. She came down the mezzanine stairs. She walked across the lobby floor, and she stopped next to him, not behind him, not in front of him, beside him. "This is Silas Cole," she said to the room. Not loudly. The marble carried it. "He came here this morning for a job interview. I'd like him to stay." She looked at Marcus Elroy. Marcus was no longer calculating. He'd reached whatever conclusion the calculation had produced and was now standing with his arms uncrossed and his face composed in the manner of a man who had decided that composure, was the only asset he had left and intended to spend it carefully. "Marcus," Vivian said, his name in the room, across the room, publicly. It had a weight to it that private conversations didn't have. "I'd like you to come forward." The lobby went, if possible, quieter than it had already been. Quieter in the specific way of people who were no longer uncertain what kind of gathering this was. Marcus came forward. He walked with the deliberate ease of a man who'd been navigating corporate rooms his whole career and knew that the worst thing you could do in any of them was appear to lose your footing. He stopped about 6 feet from where Vivian and Silas were standing. "I want to give you the opportunity to say something," Vivian said. "Not to me, to him." Marcus looked at Silas. Silas looked back at him without expression. Not hostile, just steady, the way a man looks at something he's been waiting a long time to see and has rehearsed being calm about. There was a pause long enough to be uncomfortable. "I didn't personally make the decision about the interview," Marcus said. "I know that," Vivian said. "What I'm asking is whether you want to say something about the situation. Not the decision, the situation." Another pause. Marcus was smart enough to understand what she was actually offering him, which was a sliver of something. Acknowledgement, maybe, or just the record showing that he'd not been completely silent at the moment when silence was the worst choice. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. He said it to Silas. It was 2 words, and it wasn't enough, and they both knew it. And Silas's face registered that knowledge without any of the satisfaction that should have come with an apology from a man like Marcus Elroy. Because apologies from people in Marcus's position, in rooms like this one, with an audience, had a specific quality to them. They were issued toward the outcome, not toward the person. Silas had received enough of them over the years to know the difference. He nodded. It was a small nod, sufficient without being gracious, which was the correct amount. Vivian looked at Dennis Webb, who was still near the back pillar. Webb met her eyes. He didn't move forward. She hadn't asked him to, not yet, and she let him stay where he was for now because what she needed from Webb was going to require a different kind of conversation and a different kind of room. "I want to say one more thing," Vivian said to the lobby, "and then we're going to let people get back to their day." She looked at the room, the analysts, the operations staff, the HR people, the coordinators and department assistants and facilities crew who made up the majority of the 200 people currently standing on marble floors looking at her. "The reason I'm doing this here, in this lobby, is because this is where it happened. And I want everyone who was here this morning, who watched what happened, who went back to their desk and processed it the way you process these things, as something that occurred in a lobby that wasn't your business. I want you to understand that it was your business. Not because you did something wrong, but because the only way these things keep working, the small corruptions, the paperwork buried in archive drawers, the applications that disappear from systems, the only way they keep working is if the people who witness them treat them as someone else's problem." She looked around the room. They're not someone else's problem. They're the company's problem, which means they're yours. And if you see something in this building that looks like what was done to this man this morning or 15 years ago, I am telling you directly, it is your business to say so. She looked at Silas. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude. She didn't think it was gratitude. Not exactly. It was something closer to the look of a person who has been carrying something heavy alone for a very long time and has just had someone else put their hands on it, not to take it away, but just to acknowledge its weight, which is not the same thing as relief, but is related to it. She turned back to the room. "Thank you for coming down," she said, which was a slight absurdity since they hadn't had much choice, but she said it because it was the kind of thing you said when you were trying to return a room to something functional. "You can go back to work." The lobby began to dissolve. Slowly, the way lobbies dissolved when people were processing something and needed motion as a mechanism for doing it. In clusters, in pairs, people moved toward the elevators, toward the stairwells, past the security desk where Bryce was studiously looking at something on his screen that was probably not very interesting. Sandra Price walked past on the way to the elevator and she stopped, just stopped, in front of Silas, and she said, "I'm the one who called you. I'm glad you came in." "Me too," Silas said. His voice was slightly rough. "Thank you for making the call." She nodded and kept walking. Marcus was already gone, had moved toward the elevator during the dispersal, which was what Vivian had expected. There was going to be a conversation with Marcus, but it was going to happen in a different room, with legal present, and it was going to be a conversation about his future at this company rather than about the past, because those were two separate problems, and Vivian had learned from watching her father that mixing them was a way to lose both. The lobby was mostly empty now. Vivian and Silas stood in it the way people stood in spaces after events, slightly awkward with the aftermath, uncertain of the transition from what just happened to what comes next. Silas looked around at the marble floor, the high ceiling, the potted trees in the corners. It was the same room it had been this morning when he'd been walked across it toward the door. Same floor, same light, same building. "I didn't expect any of that," he said. Not to Vivian specifically, just to the room. "I know." "You didn't have to do it in public." "No," she said. "But it was right to." She paused. "Not because I needed an audience, because the people who were here this morning deserved to know what they'd seen, and because—" She stopped. She'd been about to say something she'd been thinking since she read her father's final line in the archive room. She looked at the folder in her hands instead. "Because my father wrote that this company should do whatever it could when the time came. I'm taking him at his word." Silas was quiet for a moment. The lobby settled into its ordinary sounds. Ventilation, the distant percussion of the city outside, the elevator chime on the far side. "What does that mean practically?" he said. "What comes next?" "It means we need to have a longer conversation," Vivian said, "about what's right and what's possible, and what this company can actually do versus what I can promise you in a lobby." She looked at him. "And it means there are some people in this building who are going to be having some very different kinds of conversations tomorrow than they had this morning." She thought about Marcus, still calculating whatever calculation he was on now. She thought about Dennis Webb in his glass-walled office. She thought about what Patricia Sowers had said. Let the documents do the talking. And she thought about the fact that the documents had been talking for 15 years to an empty room, and now they weren't anymore. Silas nodded slowly. "All right," he said. It was the third time today he'd said it. On the sidewalk, in the conference room, now here. She was starting to understand it as his version of something. Not resignation, not enthusiasm, just the word a person used when they decided to keep going forward rather than backward. And they weren't ready to call it anything more complicated than that. The lobby was quiet around them, the marble bright under the afternoon light coming through the front glass, the harbor invisible beyond the building but present in the way harbors were always present in buildings like this one, in the orientation, in the history, in the reason the thing had been built where it was built. Silas looked at the front doors. He'd walked in through those doors this morning with a borrowed tie and an appointment that didn't exist anymore, and the particular braced quality of a man preparing to be told no. He was still standing here. The doors were still there. Some things, he was slowly beginning to think, didn't resolve cleanly into before and after. Some things just shifted. The weight didn't go away. The years didn't reverse. The doors didn't stop being the same doors. But the room on the other side of them was different now. The room knew something it hadn't known this morning, and the people in it were carrying that knowledge back to their desks, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, something. He turned away from the doors and looked at Vivian Hart, who was standing in her father's lobby holding her father's files, and who had walked out of a meeting he hadn't known existed and come out to a sidewalk and asked him his name before she knew what his name meant. "You said a longer conversation," he said. "Yes." "Where?" She looked around the lobby briefly. Then she looked at the elevator. "Upstairs," she said. "There's a lot more to go through, and I think we should probably start from the beginning." The elevator ride up to the 34th floor was quiet in the way that elevator rides were quiet after significant things had just happened. Not uncomfortable, just full. The kind of silence two people share when they've both been through something and haven't yet figured out what to do with the residue of it. Vivian had chosen the 34th floor conference room deliberately, not the 14th, where they'd spent the morning, not the executive suite on 38, which was her father's territory in ways that still felt complicated. The 34th had a room she used for conversations she wanted to be serious without being ceremonial. A rectangular table, 8 chairs, a window that looked out over the harbor at an angle that showed more water than building. She set her father's file on the table and sat down, and Silas sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them said anything because starting from the beginning, as she'd said in the lobby, was harder than it sounded when you were actually sitting in front of it. Patricia Sowers arrived 4 minutes later, which meant she'd been waiting nearby, which was like Patricia. She had her legal pad in a second folder, her own notes, cross-referenced with the archive documents, and she took the chair at the end of the table the way she always took chairs, without asking whether the seat was available. "Mr. Cole," Patricia said, setting down her things, "I've been reading about you for the last 2 hours." "Nothing good, I assume," Silas said. "On the contrary." She opened her folder. "The Drexler report is poorly constructed. It's professionally done, but the construction is poor in the way that things are poor when they're built to survive a cursory reading rather than a careful one. Your father's account," she said to Vivian, "is the opposite. It's the account of someone who knew what the details meant and documented them specifically because they would matter to someone who knew what they were looking at." Silas leaned forward slightly. "What does that mean in practical terms?" "It means the record of what happened to you can be challenged," Patricia said. "The regulatory finding, the partial clearance with conditions, was issued by the Maritime Operations Review Board. The board no longer exists in its original form. It was restructured in 2019, but the successor body maintains jurisdiction over appeals of prior findings." She looked at him steadily. "The conditions attached to your clearance were never formally removed because you never formally petitioned for removal. If you had submitted a petition, and if you had submitted the documentation that's in this archive, the conditions would very likely have been struck." Silas was quiet. He was processing this the way he processed everything, without visible reaction, working it through internally before he let anything show. "Why didn't I know the documentation existed?" he said. "Because it was in our archive," Vivian said, "and it shouldn't have been. It should have been submitted by my father during your review period. He chose not to submit it because he was worried about the outcome of a failed intervention. That was his call to make, and I think he made it out of care rather than indifference. But it had consequences." She paused. "I'm not trying to defend him. I'm explaining it because I think you deserve to know what the reasoning was." Silas looked at the table. He had a way of going very still when he was working something through, the kind of stillness that came from years of needing to make decisions quickly, and having learned that the half-second before the decision was the part that counted. "He thought submitting it might make things worse," Silas said. "That's what his notes say." He might have been right. Silas sat back. The review board at the time, they weren't friendly to rescue operatives who pushed protocol boundaries, regardless of outcome. If Hart Maritime submitted a document supporting my account, and the board still found against me, that would have looked like powerful people trying to protect someone in failing, which in maritime regulatory circles in those days meant you were done. He looked at Vivian. "I'm not saying what he did was right. I'm saying the calculus was real." "I know," Vivian said. And the thing was, she did know. She'd sat with her father's notes long enough to understand that he hadn't been cowardly. He'd been caught between two kinds of risk and had chosen the less visible one, the one that left the door open instead of slamming it, and then time had run out before he could walk back through it. Patricia set down her pen. "I've drafted a preliminary petition for submission to the successor review body," she said. "It's a document, not a commitment. I want you to read it and tell me if there's anything in your own account of the Kelleran incident that needs to be added or corrected before we file anything." She pushed a stack of pages across to Silas. He picked them up and read, not quickly. He turned pages. He stopped twice, once, for a long time, on what Vivian suspected was the section that reproduced her father's account verbatim. When he set them down, he didn't immediately say anything. "The other witness," he said finally. "The one your father talked to. The rescue team member who corroborated the verbal clearance." "Yes," Patricia said. "That would be Decker." He said the name with a particular quality. Not quite fondness, not quite something else. "Ray Decker. He left Maritime in 2015. He's in Port Lennox, I think, doing boat maintenance work. Can you reach him?" "Haven't talked to him in about 3 years." He paused. "We didn't stay in close contact. Things got difficult between us after the review. He blamed himself for not speaking up more during the process, and I got tired of telling him it wasn't his fault. And eventually we just didn't talk. He put the petition pages down. But I can find him. If he's willing to provide a formal statement, it strengthens the petition substantially, Patricia said. Combined with your father's account and the inconsistencies in the Drexler report itself, we have a reasonable evidentiary basis. What's the realistic outcome? Silas said. He asked it directly, looking at Patricia rather than Vivian, which told Vivian he was treating it as a legal question rather than an emotional one and wanted a legal answer. The conditions are struck from the clearance record, Patricia said. The partial notation becomes a full clearance with no conditions. That doesn't restore the years, it doesn't undo what the regulatory cloud did to your professional standing in the period when it would have mattered most. But it corrects the record. She paused. Which matters for what Vivian wants to discuss with you next. Silas looked at Vivian. She had been sitting with her hands flat on the table listening, and now she straightened slightly and looked back at him the way she'd been looking at him all day, directly, without the managing quality that most people in her position brought to difficult conversations. The softening and hedging that was supposed to make things easier, but mostly just made them longer. I'd like to offer you a position, she said. He was quiet. Not the coordinator role you applied for, she said. That position is mid-level, and mid-level is not where your experience and judgment belong. I want to create a Director of Maritime Safety Operations role. It doesn't currently exist at this company. We have safety protocols, we have compliance staff, but we don't have a dedicated senior-level position that sits at the operational leadership table and is specifically responsible for field safety standards and incident response protocols. She paused. That's a gap in how we're structured, and it's the kind of gap that causes the kind of problems that caused the Kelleran incident in the first place. Contractors operating with insufficient oversight, safety certifications passing through too fast, response protocols that look correct on paper and fail in the field. Silas was very still. You want to give me a senior executive role in, he said. Not a question exactly, more like a statement he was testing the weight of. I want to put the right person in a role that this company needs, she said. You happen to be that person. Those aren't separate things. I've been cleaning tables, he said, for 14 months. I know that. I don't have a degree. I have an operational license with 15-year-old conditions attached to it that we're hoping to have removed by a regulatory body that may or may not. The petition is solid, Patricia said without apology. And the position doesn't require a degree. It requires field experience, protocol expertise, and the specific kind of judgment that you have demonstrated, including the judgment to go into the water when going into the water was the right call, and to stand by that decision for 15 years while everyone with more institutional power than you said otherwise. She paused. That's not a quality we can hire out of a graduate program. Silas put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment, the scarred knuckles, the broad palms, the left forearm, where the tattoo was invisible, under his sleeve, but present in the way things were present that had been part of you long enough to just be part of you. I need to understand what I'd actually be doing, he said, not the title. What does the work look like? And that was the right question, which was itself information. Vivian had offered things to people before, promotions, lateral shifts, opportunities, and the ones who asked about the title first were a different kind of person than the ones who asked about the work. Silas had asked about the work. So she told him. She spent 40 minutes laying it out, the company's current safety infrastructure, where the gaps were, what the regulatory requirements looked like versus what the actual field conditions were, the contracting relationships that needed review, the incident response protocols that hadn't been updated since before her father's time. She told him about the Oran Maritime Group proposal that Marcus Elroy had been pushing and what her concerns were about it, and why she needed someone at the leadership table who understood the field well enough to challenge the numbers when the numbers were being used to tell a story rather than to report one. Silas listened without interrupting. Occasionally he asked a clarifying question, not the kind that filled silence, but the kind that came from someone who had heard a gap and wanted it addressed. He asked about the contracting oversight structure, about how incident reports were currently reviewed, about whether field coordinators had direct reporting lines to leadership, or whether everything went through department heads. By the time she finished, the harbor light through the window had shifted. It was past 4 o'clock. "Marcus Elroy," Silas said. "Where does he stand after today?" It was a sharp question, and she appreciated it. "That depends on what the next conversation with him looks like," she said. "He's been here 8 years. He's competent at certain things. What he did with the Oren proposal, building a business case around a contractor relationship that predates his employment here, that's something I need to examine carefully, and Patricia is already on it." She looked at her hands briefly. "What I can tell you is that the person who ends up sitting at the leadership table isn't going to be someone who sees the Oren proposal as a good idea, regardless of what the cost reduction numbers look like on a slide." Silas nodded slowly. "And Dennis Webb?" "Dennis is going to be given the opportunity to resign before the end of this week," Vivian said. "The credential modification is documented. He knew who you were and made a unilateral decision to erase you from the process. That's not a performance issue. It's a character issue, and character issues at VP level don't have remediation programs." She said it clearly and without drama, because it was true, and because she'd already made the decision, and pretending otherwise would have been the kind of softening she didn't have patience for. Silas was looking at her with that measuring quality again, but it was different than it had been this morning on the sidewalk. This morning, the measuring had been about threat assessment, how much to trust, how much to give, how much the next 30 seconds was going to cost him. Now it was something else. She thought it might be the specific way a person looked at something when they were trying to decide whether to want it. Wanting something was a risk. She understood that. It was a risk that got larger the more times you'd wanted something and had it taken away. And Silas Cole had had enough things taken away that wanting something, even something reasonable, even something he was qualified for and deserved, would carry a weight of exposure that she couldn't entirely account for. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "Why are you doing this?" Not challenging, genuine. "Not the lobby thing." "I understand the lobby thing. That was right, and I know it was right. I mean this, the position, the petition, the—" He stopped, looked for the word. "The degree of effort." She thought about the honest answer, which was multiple things that didn't resolve into one clean explanation. "Because my father wrote it down," she said, "and then he died before he could do anything more with it. And I found it, and I read it, and I came to understand that this company was part of what happened to you. Indirectly, imperfectly, but part of it. And I run this company now." She paused. "And because the right person for the role is sitting across from me, and I'm not willing to waste that because of a borrowed tie and a scuffed jacket and 15 years of bad paperwork." Something moved across his face. Not sentiment, more like the quiet movement of something that had been braced against something for a very long time and had just registered that the pressure was different than expected. He was quiet for long enough that Patricia made a small movement, not interrupting, just adjusting her weight in the chair the way people did when a silence had gone on past the length where they needed to hold position. "I'll need to think about it," Silas said. "Not the work. I understand the work, and I can do the work. But—" He stopped again. He looked at the window and then back at the table. "I need to call someone before I say yes to anything." "Decker?" Vivian said. "Yeah." He looked slightly surprised that she'd landed on it immediately. If this is real, then it should be. I want him to know first, before it becomes official. He went through the same thing I did, and the only difference between us is that he got out of maritime voluntarily and I got pushed. I'm not going to walk into something like this without making sure he hears it from me directly." It was an unexpected thing to say, and it landed with unexpected weight. Not because it was noble, it wasn't performing nobility. It was just the honest reasoning of a man who thought about the people in his history before he moved forward without them. "Take the time you need," Vivian said. "The offer isn't going anywhere." He nodded. "There's one more thing," Patricia said. She'd been quiet for the last several exchanges, which with Patricia meant she was waiting for the right moment rather than being deferential. "The public record, the regulatory finding, the partial clearance, the Kelleran incident as it currently exists in documented form, all of that is going to take time to correct through official channels. Petitions have timelines. The successor review body meets on a quarterly schedule." She looked at Silas. What Vivian is offering you in terms of employment is separate from the regulatory petition and can proceed independently of it. But I want you to understand that the official correction of the record is something we're committed to pursuing regardless of whether you accept the position. That's not contingent. Silas looked at her. You're saying I don't have to take the job to get the petition filed? Correct. The petition is being filed because the record is wrong and it can be corrected. That's the reason. Your employment decision is yours to make on its own terms. He absorbed this. Vivian could see him sorting through it. The way the pieces related to each other, what it meant that they were being offered separately, what that separation was designed to communicate. All right, he said, a different all right than the others. Not agreement, just acknowledgement of the information. Patricia closed her folder. I'll have the petition ready for your review by end of week. Nothing will be filed without your signature. She picked up her things and left without ceremony, which was Patricia's version of giving people space, exiting efficiently, rather than lingering in a way that would require more conversation. Vivian and Silas were alone in the conference room again. The harbor was orange-gray now through the window, the afternoon light going toward evening. Container ships still moving, slow and enormous, doing what they did regardless of what was happening in the buildings along the waterfront. I should go, Silas said. I'm supposed to be at the diner at 6. You're still going in? I'm still employed there, he said. Until I'm not. He said it without self-consciousness, just as a fact about his situation. I'm not going to leave them short-handed on a Tuesday night because something happened today. She thought about that. The borrowed tie, the bus ride, the clean tables. A man who'd led a water rescue in 10-foot swells and spent 15 years after that doing whatever was available and showing up when he said he would, because that was the version of integrity that was available to him. I'll walk you down, she said. They took the elevator to the lobby. It was close to 5 now, and the building's day shift traffic was filtering through. People heading out, the light through the front glass going amber, the marble floors looking different in the late afternoon light than they had at 10 in the morning when everything was different. Bryce was still at the security desk. He looked up when Vivian and Silas crossed the lobby. Silas looked back at him, briefly, without stopping. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't warm. It was just two people in the same room acknowledging that they'd been in the same room before under different circumstances, and both of them knowing it. At the front door, Silas stopped. He turned to Vivian. He put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was what she'd expected. Firm, direct, the handshake of someone who'd been taught that how you shook hands said something and had decided what it said a long time ago. I'll call Decker tonight, he said. Take whatever time you need. He nodded. He looked at the door. He looked at the lobby one more time. The high ceiling, the marble, the trees in the corners that were the same trees they'd always been, indifferent to everything that had happened between their potted roots and the roof. This morning, he said, when I came in, I told myself it was probably going to be nothing, that the interview was probably going to be a courtesy thing, or the kind of meeting where they'd look at the paperwork and tell me we weren't a fit. He paused. I've had a lot of those. I know. I still came in. I know that too, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pushed the door and walked out into the amber light of the late afternoon, down the steps and onto the sidewalk, in the borrowed tie and the jacket that didn't quite fit through the shoulders, turning left toward the bus stop without hesitation, because he knew where the bus stop was from this morning, and some things you just retained. Vivian stood at the glass front of the building and watched him go. The conversations that followed happened in the order she'd planned them, which was the order that made the most logical sense, even if it didn't make the easiest emotional sense. Marcus Elroy first, because Marcus was the larger problem. She met with him at 5:30 in her office, not the conference room, her actual office, because the configuration mattered, and she wanted him in a chair across from her desk rather than at a table where the geometry suggested equivalence. Marcus came in already in position, which was how she thought of it, in position, because Marcus was always in some position, always running some version of the interaction slightly ahead of you so that your words arrived into a frame he'd built rather than one you'd chosen. He sat down with his hands on his knees and his jacket buttoned and his face wearing the expression of a man who was prepared to have a difficult conversation and had decided that being prepared was the same as having leverage. Before you say anything, he said, I want you to know that I had no knowledge of the modification to Cole's interview record. I know you didn't make the modification, Vivian said. I don't know yet what you knew, and I don't know yet what you asked. And I'm going to be honest with you, Marcus, but I'm not going to resolve that today. Legal is looking at it, and what they find is going to determine what the next conversation between us looks like. He shifted slightly. I've been at this company for 8 years. I know. The Oren proposal is a legitimate business case. The Oren proposal is on hold, indefinitely. She looked at him. Not because the cost numbers are wrong, but because I don't trust the process that produced them, and right now I don't fully trust the person who was driving them. That might change depending on what legal finds. It might not. She said it without anger, because anger would have given him something to engage with. What I need from you right now is simple. Stay available, be honest with legal when they come to you, and don't do anything that complicates the picture further. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He was calculating again. She could always see the calculation in him. It was one of the things that made him effective, and one of the things that made him exhausting. This time, whatever the calculation was, it produced a different result than usual. He didn't push back. He didn't deploy the smooth reframe. He just nodded. All right, he said. When he left, she sat with the quiet of her office for a few minutes. The harbor was dark now through the window, the container ships visible only by their lights, moving along the black water in a slow parade. Dennis Webb was shorter. She asked Patricia to be present, which told Webb everything about the nature of the conversation before it started. She walked him through the system log documentation, the credential modification, the specific decision he'd made, and what it had cost. She told him she was giving him the opportunity to resign by Friday, that the alternative was a formal termination for cause with a complete record of the system modification attached to his personnel file, and that she would leave the choice to him. He didn't argue. He looked, toward the end of the conversation, like a man who was very tired. Not tired in the immediate sense, but tired in the deeper sense. The sense of someone who'd been running a particular kind of performance for a long time and had just lost the energy to keep it going. I didn't think he'd get past the interview anyway, Webb said. It wasn't an excuse. It was something else. An explanation offered without the expectation that it would change anything, the way people sometimes offered explanations at the end when the outcome was already set. That wasn't your call to make, Vivian said. No, he said. It wasn't. She let Patricia handle the HR logistics and walked back to her office and stood at the window for a while, looking at the harbor lights. Silas called her the following morning. It was 8:47. She knew because she was already in. She was always in early, and her phone was on the desk when it buzzed with the number she'd given him. I talked to Decker, he said. How did that go? A pause. Better than I expected. Worse than I hoped in some ways. He has some things he's been carrying around from the Kelleran review that he hasn't fully put down. Knowing that your father documented it, that hit him harder than I thought it would. Another pause. But he'll do the statement. He said yes. I'm glad. He also said, Silas stopped. When he continued, his voice had a different quality than it had had yesterday. Not softer exactly, but less armored. He said I should take the job. He used some language I won't repeat, but the core message was that. Vivian sat down at her desk. And what do you say? The pause this time was longer, long enough that she could hear the ambient sound on his end, something like kitchen noise, which meant he was at the diner, which meant he'd called her before his shift. I say yes, Silas said. I say yes, and I want to understand the full scope of the role, and I want it structured correctly, and I want to know what authority I'll actually have versus what authority looks good on an org chart. He said the last part without apology, because he'd been in enough positions where the authority was theoretical to know that the distinction mattered. But yes, we'll structure it correctly, Vivian said. You have my word on that, and you can hold me to it. I intend to. There was a brief silence that was not uncomfortable. Outside Vivian's window, the harbor was morning bright, the water going blue-gray in the early light, the container ships doing their slow, patient work along the waterfront. One more thing, Silas said. Yes? The diner. I need to give them 2 weeks. She had been half expecting something complicated, and the simplicity of it caught her slightly off guard. Of course, she said. They've been good to me, he said. Not everyone has been, and they have been, and I'm not going to walk out on a Tuesday night crowd without finding them coverage first. 2 weeks is fine. All right. He paused once more. Tell your father's people, Patricia, tell her I'll have some additional detail to add to the petition about a conversation with Decker on the night of the rescue before anyone knew there was going to be a review. Decker remembered something I'd forgotten, and it's specific enough to matter. I'll tell her. Good. A beat. I'll see you in 2 weeks then. 2 weeks, Vivian said. The call ended. She put the phone down on the desk and looked at the harbor for a long time. The water moving in the way water always moved, indifferent to the specific weight of things, but carrying everything anyway, the way it had always done, all the way from the Kelleran shelf to here. She thought about her father's last line. Whatever this company can do, when the time comes, it should do. She picked up her phone again and called Cleo. I need HR to begin the paperwork for a new senior role, she said. Director of Maritime Safety Operations, reporting directly to me. She paused. And I need the lobby security log from yesterday morning removed from the general system and transferred to the personnel file we're building. All of it. I want a complete record. Got it, Cleo said. Anything else? Vivian looked at the harbor. Get me the full Orin Maritime audit history, she said. Everything they've submitted. I want to read it myself before anyone else touches it. I'll have it by noon. Thank you, Cleo. She put the phone down. The morning moved forward the way mornings did, with the specific indifference of time, which kept going regardless of what had been resolved and what was still in process, and what two people had said to each other on the phone in the early light before a shift at a diner started. 2 weeks, Silas had said. 2 weeks felt like both nothing and a long time, depending on where you were standing. The 2 weeks passed. The way 2 weeks passed when you were working two different lives simultaneously, slowly in the mornings, fast by the end of the day, and strange in the middle where the two lives overlapped in your head without quite making sense next to each other. Silas worked his shifts at the Port District Diner. He covered a Tuesday dinner rush, 2 Saturday mornings, a Wednesday lunch where the short-order cook called in sick, and Silas ended up at the grill for 4 hours straight, moving through the rhythm of it the way he'd moved through every physically demanding thing he'd ever done. Without drama, without complaint, by simply staying in motion until the motion was no longer required. His manager, a woman named Bev, who'd been running the place for 11 years and had the specific brand of competence that came from never having been able to afford incompetence, noticed that he was different those 2 weeks. Not distracted. He wasn't the kind of man who got distracted, but somewhere else in some layer beneath the surface, operating on a frequency she couldn't quite tune into. On his last shift, a Friday, Bev made him a plate of eggs and toast and sat across from him at the counter after the dinner rush had thinned to 2 tables. You got something lined up, she said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. He ate for a moment. Maritime company, director-level position. She looked at him. Bev was 58 and had seen a lot of things in a diner that served the dock district, and one of the things she'd seen was the specific way certain people arrived in places like hers. Not broken exactly, but misaligned, like something in them was pointed in a direction the current environment couldn't accommodate. She'd seen that in Silas from his first week, the way he cleaned tables with a thoroughness that was disproportionate to the requirements of the task, the way he listened to the dock workers talk about the water with an attention that was different from the attention of someone who hadn't been out on it. Maritime, she said. Yeah. That where you came from? Long time ago. She poured him more coffee without asking. You going to be all right there? He looked at her. It was a genuinely simple question, and he took it seriously because she'd asked it seriously and because Bev had a way of asking things that deserved real answers. I don't know yet, he said, but I think so. She nodded. Good enough. When he left that night, she gave him an envelope with 2 weeks of additional pay she'd been quietly setting aside since his second week, when she'd understood the kind of man she'd hired and had started worrying, in the background of her days, about what came next for him. He tried to give it back. She told him to stop being stupid. He kept it. He rode the bus home to the Declan Flats with the envelope in his jacket pocket and the harbor visible in strips between the buildings as the bus moved through the city, the water dark and present and running all the way out to wherever the sky came down. He called his sister in Beaumont that night. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting. She'd known something was happening because he'd told her, briefly and inadequately, the week before. She listened while he gave her the full version, which took longer than he expected because somewhere in the middle of it, his voice did something he hadn't fully prepared for, and he had to stop twice before he could continue. His sister, whose name was Dana and who had been carrying her own version of her brother's disappearance from the life he should have had for 15 years, did not say anything for a long moment when he finished. Then she said, "I want to hear everything, but first I need you to tell me you're okay." Yeah, he said. "I think I actually am." "That's the first time you've said that, and I believed it," she said. He didn't have an answer for that. He just sat with it, on the edge of his bed in the studio apartment with the cracked mirror above the bathroom sink, and let it be true. The Monday morning he walked into Hart Maritime Tower for the second time was different from the first in almost every measurable way. It was different in the light. The sky had broken open into actual blue, the harbor bright and chop-covered, the kind of morning the city got maybe 30 times a year, and that made the waterfront look like it had been placed there on purpose. It was different in how he was dressed. His own jacket this time, darker, fitted correctly through the shoulders, bought in a second-hand shop on the Strand District on Saturday morning because he'd stood in front of his closet and understood that the borrowed tie had served its purpose, and he could let it go now. It was different in what he was carrying, a leather folder that had belonged to his father, worn at the corners in the way good things went worn, containing the notes he'd made over the past 2 weeks about Hart Maritime's current safety infrastructure and what he already knew needed to change. He'd spent the 2 weeks reading. Vivian had sent him the company's current operational documentation, the incident report archive, the contracting records for their field response units, and the safety compliance filings from the previous 3 years. He'd read all of it. Not skim read, actually read, with a pen in his hand and the leather folder filling up with questions and observations, and the specific kind of judgment that came from 11 years of knowing the difference between what a safety protocol looked like on paper and what it looked like at 11 o'clock at night in 8-foot swells 40 miles offshore. What he'd found was not catastrophic. It was something potentially more dangerous than catastrophic, which was the condition of things being almost right. Close enough to correct that they passed inspection, far enough from correct that they would fail at exactly the moment when failure was least affordable. He was going to have a lot to say about that. He was going to say it clearly, in rooms with people who had more institutional authority than he did, and who were going to need to be convinced, and some of them were going to resist, and that was fine. He'd spent 15 years being someone that people in those rooms didn't have to listen to. That had changed, and he was going to use it. The front doors opened. He went in. The lobby was its own thing. He'd thought about this, about how it would feel to walk back into the marble space where 2 guards had grabbed his arm 4 weeks ago, where 200 people had stood and looked at him while Vivian spoke about the Kelleran incident and his name and 15 years of buried documentation. He'd thought about it, and he'd decided, in the way he decided most things, that feelings about a room were not a reason to behave differently in it. But the lobby was different anyway, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to someone who hadn't been in it on that other morning. But the people at the reception desk looked up when he came in, and one of them, a young woman he hadn't seen before, said, "Good morning, Mr. Cole," before he'd introduced himself, which meant she'd been told who he was and that he was coming, and the simple fact of being expected rather than challenged was its own thing that he wasn't entirely prepared for. Bryce was at the security desk. They looked at each other. It was a brief look, both of them knowing that there wasn't a version of this that was comfortable, and both of them old enough and grown up enough not to need it to be comfortable. Bryce gave him a nod. Silas gave one back. It wasn't resolution exactly. It was acknowledgement that 2 people had been in the same room when something went wrong and were now both going to have to keep existing in that room, and that the only way forward was through. He took the elevator to the 34th floor. Vivian was already in the conference room with Cleo and a woman he hadn't met, introduced as Renata Fuhrman, head of operations strategy, who had the specific quality of attention of someone who had already read everything about him and had formed opinions she was keeping to herself until she'd heard him speak. He liked that about her immediately, the withholding until verified approach. It was honest. There was also Patricia Sowers with her legal pad, who said good morning without ceremony and then looked back at her notes because she had things to attend to. Vivian stood up when he came in. She didn't make it a moment. She just stood, offered her hand, and said, "Welcome back," in a tone that treated it as the practical thing it was and not the weighty thing it also was, which he appreciated. "Thank you," he said. They sat down. The first meeting lasted 3 hours. It was not a formality meeting. No one treated it like one, and he hadn't been prepared for one. Vivian had structured it as a working session. Here is the current state of our maritime safety infrastructure. Here are the decisions pending. Here is what we need someone in this role to do in the next 90 days. She went through it with the specificity of someone who had done the reading herself rather than delegating it, which told him something about what kind of CEO she was. When she finished the overview, she looked at him. "What did you see in the documentation we sent you?" He opened the leather folder. He went for 45 minutes. He talked about the contractor certification gaps, 3 of their field response units operating under safety certifications that were due for renewal and hadn't been formally flagged, which meant they were compliant on paper through a timing technicality rather than through current verification. He talked about the incident reporting chain, which had 3 layers of department head review before anything reached the senior leadership table, which meant that by the time leadership saw a field incident report, it had been processed through 3 levels of institutional interpretation, and the raw account was often unrecognizable. He talked about the Oren Maritime proposal, not as a judgment on whether Oren was a good company, but as a structural question. Anytime you contracted out a coordination function, you were also contracting out the accountability for that function. And the Kelleran incident was a direct example of what happened when accountability was contractually ambiguous and something went wrong. He said all of this without softening it, because it didn't benefit anyone to soften it. Renata Fuhrman, who had been taking notes with the focused efficiency of someone who took notes because the information mattered rather than because the gesture was expected, looked up. "The certification gap. How did you identify that? It's not flagged in any of the compliance filings." "That's exactly why I identified it," Silas said. "The compliance filings are the last place you'd find it. You find it in the field unit manifests, cross-referenced against the certification renewal schedule, which is in a separate system that doesn't automatically sync with compliance reporting." He paused. "Which is itself a problem." Renata looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Silas with the expression she had when something had been confirmed rather than discovered. "When did you find the certification gap?" Vivian said. 4 days ago. I spent about 6 hours on it." He looked at his notes. 3 units. 2 of them are on active deployment rotation. I'd want those pulled for recertification before they go out again." "How quickly?" Renata said. "Before the end of this week." Renata wrote something and underlined it. The conversation continued. It was the kind of conversation that left Silas slightly depleted at the end of it, not because it was difficult, but because it was the most professionally engaged he'd been in years. And that level of engagement used muscles that had been underworked for a long time, and that needed warming up. And the warming up process was its own kind of exhaustion. When it broke up at noon, Vivian walked with him to the office that had been prepared for his arrival. It was on the 32nd floor, not executive level, but not the departmental floors either. A deliberate middle positioning that said, adjacent to leadership, accountable to operations, belonging to neither camp fully. She'd told him that in their second phone call, and he'd understood it as accurate rather than as a consolation. The office had a window. It looked east, which meant it looked toward the harbor. He stood in the middle of it for a moment after Vivian left, with his leather folder under his arm and the bright morning coming through the glass and the harbor laid out below in the way the harbor always was, patient, massive, going all the way to the edge of where the sky came down. He was not going to make too much of this. He had a policy about not making too much of things, because making too much of things created a version of them in your mind that the reality was always going to fail to match. He was going to do the work. He was going to do it correctly. He was going to be, in this building, the person he had always known himself to be, and had spent 15 years unable to demonstrate in any context that was visible to anyone with the power to confirm it. That was enough. That had to be enough. And actually, looking at the harbor, at the water moving in the specific way it moved when the morning was clear and the current was running well, it actually was. 3 weeks into the role, the petition went to the Maritime Operations Review successor body. Ray Decker had driven up from Port Lennox for the filing. He hadn't needed to. His statement had been submitted electronically. Patricia had handled all the documentation. There was no procedural reason for him to be present. He'd come anyway, in a truck that needed an oil change and a jacket that was too light for the weather. And he'd sat in Patricia's office and read through the full petition before it was sent, and he'd been quiet for a long time after. Silas had been there. The two of them hadn't seen each other in 3 years, and the first 5 minutes of it were the kind of awkward that happened between people who had been close under extreme circumstances and then let the closeness go because the extremity had passed, and they hadn't known how to maintain it without the pressure that had created it. Decker was 52, thicker than Silas remembered through the chest, with a beard going silver and hands that were red from outdoor work in cold weather. He looked at Silas when he first came into Patricia's office and he said, "You look like someone who's sleeping." "Better than I was," Silas said. "I can tell." Decker sat down. He looked around Patricia's office, at the shelves of legal documents, the framed credentials, the window with the view of the building's courtyard. "This is where you work now." 32nd floor. 32nd floor. Decker repeated it with something in his voice that Silas couldn't quite identify. Then, "Good." It was one word, and it covered a great deal. After the petition was filed and Patricia had walked them through the timeline, quarterly board meeting, expected response within 60 days of submission, full decision within 120. Decker and Silas stood on the sidewalk outside the building in the cold, neither of them in a hurry to say goodbye, but also neither of them quite ready to go back to the conversation they'd been having in Patricia's office, which had been easier with the legal paperwork present. "You should have been director of something a long time ago," Decker said. "Maybe." Silas looked at the harbor end of the street, the water visible between the buildings in the far distance. "You should have been something too." Decker shrugged. It was the shrug of a man who had made his peace with a particular version of his life, not because it was the version he would have chosen, but because making peace with the version you had was the only workable alternative to spending your whole life in the wreckage of the version you'd lost. "I do all right. Boat maintenance isn't glamorous, but it's honest." He paused. "And I know what honest work feels like, which isn't nothing." "No," Silas said, "it's not nothing." They shook hands. Decker's grip was the same as it had always been. Complete, immediate. The grip of someone who'd learned it in cold water with no time for half measures. Silas gripped back the same way, and they stood like that for a moment, two men in their 50s on a city sidewalk with a harbor in the distance, accounting for something between them that didn't have a clean name but was real anyway. "Tell me how it goes," Decker said. "The petition." "You'll be the first call." Decker nodded. He walked to his truck, which was parked badly at a meter, and drove away in the direction of the highway, and Silas stood on the sidewalk until the truck was out of sight. Mutz. The board's response came in 53 days, which was faster than Patricia had expected. She called Silas at 7:40 in the morning. He was already in the office. He was always in early, it turned out, which had already become a known fact among the early arriving staff on the 32nd floor. He'd been going through the updated field unit certification schedules, which he'd redesigned with Renata over a 2-week working period, and which were now part of a new automated sync system connecting compliance reporting to field manifests, so that the gap he'd identified on his first day would be structurally impossible to miss going forward. "The conditions have been struck," Patricia said. He sat with that for a moment. "Full clearance," she said. "No conditions." The board noted the new evidence regarding the verbal authorization and the contradictions in the original supervisory statement and determined that the partial clearance finding was unsupported by the complete evidentiary record. She paused. "There's also a notation, which is unusual, they don't often do this. A notation in the decision document that the regulatory action had proceeded on the basis of incomplete evidence and that the board wished to formally register that the operative's record should reflect the correction in full. Silas set down his pen. They put that in writing, he said. In the official decision document, yes, it becomes part of the public record. He looked at the harbor through his window. The morning was gray, overcast, the water moving in the slow, dark way it moved under cloud cover. He could see a cargo vessel making its way along the channel, low in the water with the weight of whatever it was carrying, the kind of ship that moved through weather and water without asking anything of either. Thank you, Patricia, he said, for all of it. The work was yours and Ray Decker's, she said. I just filed the paperwork correctly. After he hung up, he sat in the office for a while without doing anything in particular. He wasn't processing it toward any specific emotional outcome. He was just sitting with it, the way you sat with something that had been a wound for so long that its absence was as strange as its presence, the way you sat when something was over and you weren't entirely sure yet what the landscape looked like without it. He called Decker. Decker picked up on the fourth ring, out of breath, outside somewhere with wind noise on the line. It came back, Silas said. Full clearance, conditions struck. Silence on the line. Wind. Say that again, Decker said. Full clearance? They put it in writing, a notation that the action had proceeded on incomplete evidence. More silence. When Decker spoke again, his voice was different. The roughed-up quality of a man who had just received news that had reached somewhere below the surface level and caught something down there. 15 years, Decker said. Yeah. 15 years, and a piece of paper finally says what actually happened. Yeah. A long pause. You okay? I think so, Silas said. You? Working on it. Decker exhaled. Buy me a beer sometime. Absolutely. Good. Another exhale. Good. Okay. I gotta go. I'm in the middle of something here. A pause. Silas. Yeah. You earned this. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, including yourself. Silas looked at the harbor. Same goes, he said. He told Vivian in person, which felt like the right way to do it. He knocked on her office door at 9:30, which was the specific window of her morning that Cleo had told him was generally free, and she was at her desk with a coffee cup and 3 folders and the expression of someone who had been working for a while already. She looked up. It came back, he said from the doorway. She set down the coffee cup. Full? Full. Conditions struck. And a formal notation. She stood up. Not dramatically. She just stood, which for Vivian was its own form of emphasis. She looked at him with something in her expression that was close to what he'd seen in the lobby weeks ago when she'd said she was taking her father at his word, but quieter, more interior. My father would be glad, she said. She said it simply, without decoration, which was the only way it could be said and remain honest. I think he did more than he knew, Silas said, keeping that file. It would have been easier not to. He was good at the hard version of easy things. She looked out the window. He wasn't always right about everything else, but that one he got right. Silas nodded. He thought about a man he'd never spoken to again after pulling him over the rail of a rescue vessel in the dark. A man who'd written down everything and put it in a drawer and kept it for someone who came later, which was its own kind of act. Not heroic, not dramatic, just the quiet decision to preserve the truth against the possibility of a future that might be able to use it. There were things people did in the middle of their lives that didn't reveal their importance until much later. Most of those things went unwitnessed and uncredited. The fact that this one had ended up mattering didn't make it more noble than the ones that disappeared without trace. It just made it visible. And visibility, Silas had learned over 15 years of its absence, was not the measure of the thing itself. I want to ask you something, Silas said, about the lobby, that day. Vivian looked at him. Go ahead. You said the reason you did it publicly was because the people who saw what happened in the morning deserved to know what they'd seen. He paused. That was true, but I've been thinking about it, and I think there was something else. She waited. I think you did it because the same lobby that was used to diminish something was the only place where it could be adequately corrected, he said. not as a symbolic gesture. Because the geography actually mattered. Basal, the same floor, the same marble, the same people. You can't correct in private what was done in public and have it mean the same thing. She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. That's exactly it. Your father understood that too, Silas said. He just didn't have the timing. Vivian looked at the window and the harbor beyond it, and she said nothing. And the nothing she said was the right kind. Teak. The work itself, once it settled into its own rhythm, was what Silas had expected and also different from what he'd expected in ways that surprised him. He'd expected the resistance, and the resistance was there. Not hostility, mostly, but the friction of people who had been doing things a particular way and who needed to be shown rather than told that the particular way had gaps in it. He was patient with this. He'd been the person without institutional authority for long enough to know that the path through resistance was demonstration rather than declaration, that you brought people along by showing them the problem before you named the solution, and that the ones who came along that way stayed along longer than the ones who were simply overridden. There were some who didn't come along. 2 department supervisors in the Field Operations Division who had enough tenure to feel entitled to their processes and enough defensiveness to mistake that entitlement for principle. Silas handled both of those situations the same way. Directly, in person, without the mediation of HR on the first conversation, and with the clear understanding that the second conversation would involve HR, and after that would involve Vivian. Neither of them wanted the second conversation. Both of them adjusted, imperfectly and reluctantly, which was sufficient. Renata Foreman turned out to be, 3 months in, the most valuable professional relationship he'd built in the building. She had the kind of strategic mind that complemented operational thinking. She saw systems. He saw the places where systems met the real world, and the meeting was not as clean as the diagram suggested. They had arguments, actual arguments, about the restructured contractor oversight framework and about the incident reporting chain revision, and about 3 other things that he'd stopped being able to name separately because they blurred into a general, ongoing conversation about how the company's safety infrastructure should work and what it was for. The arguments were good. They were the kind of arguments that produced better outcomes than either person's initial position. He thought about this sometimes, about what it had been like to have had ideas and judgment and experience and no room to put them. The specific frustration of knowing what the right call was and having no standing from which to make it. That frustration didn't disappear entirely when you got the standing. It transformed into something else, a responsibility, and a specific kind of vigilance about whether you were actually using it correctly or just finally having something you'd been denied and mistaking possession for competence. He tried to stay on the right side of that line. He didn't always manage it. He made decisions that in retrospect had moved too fast, and he made some that had moved too slowly. And he learned from the ones that cost him something, a relationship with a field coordinator who'd needed a different approach than Silas had given him, a protocol revision that he'd pushed through without enough consultation and had then had to walk back and redo more carefully. He walked those things back when they needed walking back, which was itself a thing he'd had to learn as something separate from competence. That acknowledging when you'd gotten it wrong was not the same as undermining your authority, that the people who worked for you trusted you more when you showed them you understood the difference between a position and a certainty. He was imperfect at all of it. He was getting better. 6 months after his first day in the office, Silas was in the building lobby at 7:15 in the morning when the cleaning crew was still working on the far side and the marble floor was damp in a strip along the east wall. He'd come in early for a reason. He had a field unit briefing at 8 and wanted the full hour before it to go through the safety assessment forms they were reviewing. But he stopped at the lobby entrance the way he sometimes stopped, just for a moment, looking at the space. He thought about the borrowed tie. He thought about the bus ride, 42 minutes, watching the city go gray in the early light. He thought about standing at this desk, right here, and saying his name to a man who hadn't found it in the system. He thought about what it had cost. Not just the morning of the interview, but everything before it. 11 years of capability going sideways, 14 months of tables and short order work, and the specific daily discipline of not letting yourself become the version of yourself that the circumstances were suggesting you were. The calls that didn't come back. The applications that went into systems and made no sound. The work of preserving something in yourself that nobody in any official capacity was confirming was worth preserving. He was 44 years old. He was on the 32nd floor of a company that had set out to correct what had been done to him, and had, in fact, done that, imperfectly, through a combination of luck and grief and a tattoo visible on a sidewalk at the wrong moment. The correction hadn't restored the years. It hadn't given him back the career he should have had in the decade when it would have compounded into something he couldn't fully calculate. It had given him what was available now, which was not the same thing but was also not nothing. He thought about what Ray Decker had said on the sidewalk. Honest work isn't nothing. And he thought about the other thing, so the thing he'd understood slowly over the past 6 months, the thing that had arrived not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of ordinary working days, that what you were capable of didn't require external confirmation to exist. It existed in the doing of it, day after day, in the decisions made correctly under pressure, and the ones made incorrectly and acknowledged in the presence you brought to the work, regardless of what the work was. The 15 years hadn't been nothing. They'd been hard and unjust and costly in ways that were never going to be fully tallied. But in them, he had remained somehow the person who had gone into the water when the conditions said he shouldn't have to. Not because someone would recognize it, not because there was a record being kept, but because the person in the water needed someone to come, and he was there. That was not a lesson he'd been trying to learn. It was just something that had happened to him and that he'd had to find a way to carry. And in the carrying of it, he'd found that it was heavier and also more durable than he'd expected either. Bryce, coming in for the morning shift, pushed through the side entrance and stopped briefly when he saw Silas standing in the lobby. He nodded. Silas nodded back. Bryce went to his desk and began his shift, and the morning moved on. The cleaning crew finished the east wall and moved on. The lobby dried. The light came through the glass front of the building in the way it came through in the mornings when the sky was clear, angled and bright, hitting the marble in a way that made it look different than it did in any other hour of the day. Silas picked up his leather folder and walked to the elevator. He pressed 32. The doors closed. The elevator moved upward through the building, through the floors, past the lobby where he'd been walked out, and the conference room where he'd waited, and the archive room in the basement where his name had sat in a folder for 15 years waiting for someone to read it correctly. He rode up through all of it and stepped out at 32 and walked down the hall to his office and sat down at his desk and opened his folder and started working. Outside the window, the harbor was doing what the harbor did, moving, always moving, the water running along the channel in the early light, the cargo vessels making their slow, patient way through the deep water to wherever they were going, carrying what they carried, indifferent to the weather, doing the work. He looked at it for one more moment, just one. Then he turned to the briefing notes, and the day began.